Aloha and welcome. Welcome to Global Connections. I'm your host, Carlos Juarez, and it gives me great pleasure to bring a guest today that we've had before. He's going to enlighten us on a variety of things. Brian Price. Dr. Price is a military historian here at Hawaii Pacific University. He teaches a wide range of courses in the history of warfare, strategy and counterinsurgency, and is particularly anchored with our diplomacy and military studies program here. And Brian, I want to just thank you for coming and joining us again on Global Connections.
My pleasure, Carlos, always.
Great to see you. And of course, what I want to share with our audience, and we're going to speak to a couple of things, an update on some of the recent work you've been doing yourself. But before we get to some of that, I want to just maybe help us get another snapshot of some of your background. You've got a fascinating one, because while you're a professor of history these days, you had an opportunity, very interesting, some years ago, the U.S. Army began, or our military began, bringing in a lot of different social scientists and academics to kind of help get both a better understanding of some of the challenges on the ground. But briefly, you served in many ways as a civilian social scientist in the Department of Defense. And just by way of a little background, tell us a little bit about that, and then also helping us into some of what we'll talk about today, European martial arts and the history of this.
Yeah. Well, I actually came from industry. I was in the internet industry first and a publisher, and then I decided to get my degree and go teach for my last career. And I was more or less at the end of that degree plan when I saw an opportunity with the Army to go do what they were calling sociocultural research in Afghanistan. And as it happened, I had every single thing that they were looking for. So it was about 1:30 in the morning, and I applied, and by 2:05, I had a phone call saying basically, when can you start? So 10 days later, I was in Fort Leavenworth getting training, which we did for about 6 months. And then I went over, was deployed to Afghanistan. I was with Task Force Lafayette, so I was working with a NATO unit and the French, going out a lot, talking to Afghan civilians, working with the Afghan National Army, trying to smooth things in a counterinsurgency environment, looking at the French plans, the American plans versus what the population's response might be, and how they felt about various things that were going on there. I did that for a tour, and then they moved me to Ghazni, where it was a much hotter environment in terms of
Where was this again?
Ghazni, which is RC East, Eastern Afghanistan.
Yes, okay, a different region.
And much more contested region, we'll put it that way. And that was a much more of a challenging assignment. The other one was challenging in a nation-building sort of sense, but Ghazni was a challenge just in the holding on by your toenails kind of sense. So I got to see sort of both sides of the coin there, and work with some fascinating people in the American Army and Special Operations, and the Afghan Army, and the French Army.
Interesting. And of course, this program itself, took a lot of either controversy or because it presented a real interesting challenge. On one hand, our military is designed to go and fight and win wars, but in the kind of conflicts we see now in this part of the world and in this part of our history, there's clearly a need to understand the social, cultural, political, and the need for our military professionals to have some eyes and ears that can provide that context. So, maybe just say a word or two about that experience
we're
itself.
not really sure how to gain that understanding. The Human Terrain Program was an experiment at looking at how to possibly do that. And I think, leveraging academic social scientists, provided that they understand the mission, is a viable thing in some contexts. There were all sorts of controversies, of course, and certain fields don't like it at all, but other fields in history, it didn't actually present that much of a problem. And I used historical methods, local and oral history techniques, to go and do the similar sort of job to what others were doing. And the essence, of course, is just understanding the situation that the people are in, because it's all about legitimacy. Who do these people believe is legitimate? Is it the Afghan government? Is it the Pashtun Taliban leadership? Is it the Hezbollah Islamic group? Who is it? And why? And if we understand those things, it's easier.
Of course, and again, just speaking to the nature of the challenges and conflicts we have today, there's so much focus on ethnic and sort of internal divisions, culture, understanding how they think, and if we're faced with these, we need that understanding. Now, your own background is quite broad. You have a wide range of interests from classical warfare through modern warfare and strategy, and today we're blessed with some interesting props. You've brought a couple of things I want to maybe have you speak to us a little bit about, and maybe by putting it in terms of some of the recent work you've done this past summer. I think if you can give us an update on some activities, and then tell us a little about these interesting props. We've got some what look like some pretty interesting, and then this one, I don't know if we can lift it briefly to show. Oh, actually we can see it there, but this is what exactly are these?
These are, I started out way back in Los Angeles when I was getting my degree at UCLA. I wanted to earn some money, so I was making film props and armory productions. And it's much better than working at McDonald's, much more fun. And I also, from an early age, 18 or so, was always fascinated by how these things might have been used. I came to it through our theory and literature and whatnot. And And so we don't know a lot. There are some pictures and some surviving artifacts. So one of the avenues you can do is you can create reproductions of the artifacts, put it on, go out and see what's possible. And I did that from, oh Lord, 83 all the way up through about 1999, when we discovered that there were some surviving fighting treatises that actually talked about how fighting was done in the 14th and 15th centuries.
And yourself as a historian, I mean, it's a valuable lesson where you're combining not just the digging of old history, but actual kind of more almost practitioner, hands-on, and in the recent work you just described, you know, when you're embedded as a civil social scientist, you know, it's seeing warfare from a different angle. And no doubt that must help enrich your own teaching and when you're talking about these things with students.
I think it does, especially because we have a lot of veteran students, of course. And so particularly in courses like the strategy course and the counterinsurgency course, to be able to say, yes, I was down there with you. And so I understand part of that, not all of it, but part of it. And you know, the thing looks different when there are bullets whizzing around as opposed to when you're sitting in a command center or when you're sitting, you know, in the ivory tower reading about it.
And the other, I mean, again, as a historian, you're able to obviously help provide that historical context. And you know, we look at maybe warfare in other times and yet challenges that we might face today. And the first instinct is to say, well, it's very different. It's, you know, the technologies and, you know, the nature of our world. And yet on some fundamental level, we seem to have been killing each other for a long time. Maybe war is different today, and no doubt it is, whether it's the weapons or just strategies. But maybe as someone who both teaches early history and warfare, what are some of the sort of talking points you say about how things are similar, how they're different?
Well, you know, warrior cultures always have a series of shared values. They always value courage, because of course you've got to have that in the line. You can't be breaking, that damages your reputation. You always got to have loyalty. All military cultures seem to have that. And prowess, of course, skill in arms, whatever that entails, whether it's today your skill in your job, but it might be skill with the shock weapons in the medieval or classical eras. But you had to have that. And then those things manifest as winning or earning honor or shame according to whether you actually act in accord with those values too. Now there are other ones that go in and out, but they all share those core values. And if you look at a guy in Iraq and Afghanistan, he's got those same things for the same reasons.
So he's keeping a long tradition. We've had,
right.
and you know, many of us, I'm certainly consider myself a pacifist. I don't like war, but actually a misperception people often have, it's often our military who are the most aware of the limitations of war and the challenges. And frankly, they're not the first ones that want to just go. And now, we're not talking about the 18-year-old that just learned how to shoot a gun, but the decision makers who have to make those tough choices, they know how hard it can be, and they've often studied that history and know that, you know, it's never quite as neat.
It's a misnomer to think that the military guys want to go to war. And it's a misnomer also that if you study war, you must be advocating it. And that's a common misperception, particularly in the university systems, not necessarily ours, but in many universities. And I think that, you know, it's one of the things that humans have been doing for a very long time. If, in fact, we are going to lessen the impact of war in whatever capacity that is, we need to understand it.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, you know, peace is something we all want and promote, and there's a lot of energy and effort, many countries that put attention into it. Scandinavians are notorious for being peacemakers of the world. But I always, and I teach myself some courses on, you know, peace building, peace, you know, related issues. You cannot understand or even advocate or make peace if you don't understand the nature of war. What's the issue? What's the nature of the conflict? And so that gets us back to why we have to study past conflicts to make sense of them, to understand the issues. And, you know, when we look at things like props, they obviously, they lend us a certain, like, oh, this different fascination, but it's also a certain realism. And talk to us a little bit about these. You mentioned, and you've also, speak a little bit, you've published a book some years ago that looked at a lot of this military gear. To tell us about that.
I promised the guy that I learned from, Aaron Toman in Wisconsin, I promised him when I was learning that I would teach 2 students. And I did teach 2 students, but the line stopped there. They didn't go out. And so I decided to record what I had learned over a decade or so, I guess it was more like 15 years, into a book form. And it's called Techniques of Medieval Armor Reproduction. And I was published in '98. And when the publisher asked me how many copies it would sell, I was like, I don't know, 500? Not very many. Well, it's now sold 17,800 copies, so it's gotten all over the place around the world and seems to have been the tone that a lot of people are using to sort of guide their beginnings in this. So what I've done is basically lay out for them the basic techniques that you can use to build out from there. And then the current generation of armorers have taken that to a new level. And the pieces we're seeing here is
so these are examples. These have been produced basically based on some of your own work and research on what, and it's a fascinating thing because, of course, the nature of conflicts today, I mean, our particularly the U.S. military, has got the tremendous equipment and the best of this and that, but on a fundamental level, this is what we're talking about in the older days.
It's the same thing in a lot of ways. In fact,
yeah.
in some ways, the engineers should look at how these things were done for 500 years
We've
because the
been doing it a
mobility is
while.
extreme here.
Yeah, yeah. And so tell us a little bit about these props in
These are
particular.
14th century pieces or reproductions of 14th century pieces. So these would have been commonly seen during the 100 Years' War, say, between England and France, or wars in between the German states. And so you've got a helmet that weighs about 13 pounds, and it is fitted with a mail, commonly misnomer called chainmail. It's actually just mail.
This would
up and
protect you
tail.
from some little swords
They
on the side.
protect against swords very, very well, particularly in the neck. And then if you look on the inside, it's, you know, a nice padded liner, which actually kind of works like a suspended helmet liner because it's stitched all the way around, something we just took us a long time to learn for the sort of Army helmets. And this piece, you know, you can fight in it all day. It's actually more comfortable than a modern Army Kevlar, at least if it's made for you.
Not today in Honolulu. It's a little muggy. I wouldn't want to be wearing this.
Yeah, and I do this in Honolulu, and it's not the most comfortable place I've been to practice this stuff.
Yeah.
The gauntlets are, you know, you want to protect your hands, and your hands are more forward than anything else. So it becomes pretty important. And a hand is very difficult to actually armor because the bones are small.
Flexible,
The metacarpals and the
moving.
metatarsals, they're just tiny. And
like-
you also have to preserve the mobility, though, because you're fighting, and you need to be able to grab things, you
Yeah,
need to be able to fight. Those are a little bit of a hybrid design. These are much more like what you might have seen with individual finger plates and so on.
Yeah, quite fascinating. And this is like 14th century?
14th century,
Wow,
late
it's
14th,
quite a long
1380s,
time.
1390s.
Looks like right out of Iron Man, you know, the latest
Yes,
movie.
there's some inspiration there too, no doubt, from the
Interesting.
historical material.
You have like a scratch in the back.
Yeah,
like,
that's right.
let me get
Or
it
if
there.
you've got a wall around here, we could.
Yeah, well, fascinating. And these props, I mean, where do they come in handy for you? You might share them in a class you're doing, but otherwise, are there? There must be, you know, conferences and people come together
conferences
to
and stuff, but
share this
we actually
insight?
practice the martial art as a living art. So
Yeah,
we pull
I
it out of
see.
the manuscripts, translate it, and of course that's an interpretive challenge right off, and then interpret it, put it together, and then teach it to other students, and then test it on the field to see if what you're doing is actually efficient.
Interesting. And, you know, we're going to continue our conversation, and among the other things, we'll take a break in just a few minutes, but I want to have you tell us a little bit more about, you know, the evolution of these martial arts. You know, they were talking about a particular time, maybe 14th, 15th century, but as Europe finds itself kind of going through, I guess, some changes with technology and armies, I mean, what are some of the things that you can share with us about how it would change? This is, you know, we all have that image of, you know, the knights in the old medieval era, but where does this begin to take a big change or like some sort of watershed moments?
We'll talk about that.
Yeah, actually, no, maybe just start it right now, and then we'll have a break in a minute
Sure.
to continue. But,
Well, of course, shock combat continued, I mean, certainly before the Greeks and all the way up until roughly the middle of the 15th century, you still have it. But of course, gunpowder is the thing that changes everything.
Okay.
So you had shock combat mostly mounted, but also on foot during the bulk of this period. And there are a lot of interesting talks that go on about, you know, was the infantryman superior or was the cavalryman superior? The medievals thought cavalrymen were. Then when gunpowder starts to come onto the field, you see first the longbow, which suggests that combined arms, the interwoven use of horse, foot, and artillery in the form of archery initially, but later in terms of cannon, would have a much more effective base than cavalry or infantry alone. But as gunpowder becomes more interesting and useful on the battlefield, armor becomes less interesting, of course. And so the very sophisticated arts that went along with how to use shock weapons began to ebb and become more sports. So they became either restricted to the cavalryman, think of the cavalryman with a saber from horseback as his arm once the carbine is out of weaponry, or then you also get the fencing art. And fencing, boxing, those come from these historical arts, but they're more sport versions of them.
you mentioned this word shock. What was it?
Shock combat, anything where you're nose to
direct
nose with
contact.
some sort of striking,
Yeah,
fists,
yeah.
weapons, whatever.
Interesting.
Ancient Egypt, Greece, all the way up through the 15th
And
century.
often, I mean, in history, we look at those moments, like you described the gunpowder, that just changed everything on the battlefield suddenly, and this, over time, becomes less, you know, the heavy armament that it entails, and I suppose eventually it becomes the mechanized, you know...
Right, that's right. But now we're back there, of course, because you send
Yeah.
people to Iraq. When I did my first Army training, there was no vest, no nothing. Now there's a thick vest, a crumple plate, shoulder pieces, neck pieces, we're right back to
Interesting.
this again.
And so there's probably some valuable lessons for those thinking about, you know, equipping our armies today that could could learn from this.
Kinesthetics and the
Yeah.
human mobility factors, I think so.
Well, we'll have a break right there and come back. I want to talk a little bit more about some of your recent work, again, some
Sure.
conference activity you've done. And also, as we get a chance, another area related to your area of research is looking at the U.S. Air Force and some
Yeah.
recent developments there. I want to ask our audience to come back and join us in a moment. We'll be right back with more on the story.
Aloha, my name is Jim Sean, and I'm host of a show called Education Movers, Shakers, and Reformers. Each week, live streaming at noon on ThinkTech Hawaii, we interview people who have special insights into education from early education through K-12, all the way through higher education and beyond. Both public and private are areas we're interested in. We dig deeper. We try to find out what it's really like to be involved in making change, advocating for it, how you reform, what people's philosophies are in reforming it. As I said, we're live streaming every Wednesday at noon on ThinkTech Hawaii. And later on, you can find these interviews on YouTube and on the Hawaii Educational Policy Center website. We hope you join us as many times as possible. Aloha.
Aloha, we're back and we're live. I'm Carlos Juarez, your host here on Global Connections, joined today by Brian Price, a military historian who gives us a good understanding of some of the early techniques and strategies and armor that were used in early times, Greek, Roman, medieval. And, this is a period where the let's say warfare in other times was really, you called it what, the shock
combat.
Shock combat. So it was like the close combat and then
Yeah.
using these kind of armaments. And yet, curiously, you come today and we're coming full circle to that now when we're sending, some professionals into some areas, they have to have their own modern version of these things. But wonder if you might elaborate a little bit more on as a historian, we look back and the challenges, how do you make history? How do you understand it, and how do you write manuscripts? I mean, where do you look to? I mean, and as you've been embarked on this for some time now, and you've published a book that looks at, I guess, the manufacturing of these things. Tell us a little bit more about that process, and maybe
Sure.
how it's both challenging, but also there might be exciting things that you find along the way. How you make history about these type of things.
Well, the first part of the problem is to actually find the manuscripts. And of course, there are European libraries and private collectors that hold most of these things. There aren't a lot. We're talking 50 books total, extending all the way from the 13th century, the very earliest one that we have, all the way up through the 16th and 17th centuries, where they were producing more printed books, so there are more copies extant and available. But of course, almost none of them are in English, certainly none in modern English. So you've got a translation problem right off the bat. The work I tend to work with is a Ferullian volume, which is a dialect of Italian, similar to Venetian, a little bit different than the sort of Tuscan Italian that everyone speaks these days. And so when you look at the text, first of all, you have to figure out what the little squiggles are on the page and bring that into the sort of Roman characters that you can read. As you do that more and more, and I had paleography courses in my graduate school studies, so that helped. But then you've got still a spelling that looks archaic, and you do like you might do with Beowulf, you might say it out loud and see if you can find out what the word is. So first you've got the translation problem, you're bringing it into the modern language. And this is actually a problem even for people who may, in the Italian sense, may speak Italian, because words have changed their meaning in 600 years. So they may assume that the word means the same as it means now, but if you use a 15th or 16th century dictionary, that might not be the case. So it involves checking every word when you go down through it. And that seems tedious, but some of it can be really interesting. There was a fellow who interpreted one of the movements as always move the front foot first, and that gave him a certain way that the actions go. But the translation actually literally is step off the line, sort of if you need to. Well, that tactically really changes the thing. So when you discover these things, you then quickly pick up the sword, get your part, and it's like, wait, come over now. Stand there, I think we just discovered something here. So you're trying to reconstruct it from that phrase. But even then, even if you've got the book and the weapons and the armor and you're reconstructing the stuff, the big question is still, so what? What does it mean?
That mean? And I guess in some ways I think of you as sort of like an anthropologist, where you're finding these materials, because these are the reproductions. And yet we certainly have, I've been to places throughout Europe where you've got collections of armor and things, and part of it must be just looking at that and understanding how things change, what was new and what did that mean, and exactly how do you interpret that, and sort of painstaking work. And then this is where, as an academic, you come together and share your ideas with others, they validate them, they take a different approach, different theory, and you begin accumulating new information.
That's right.
Because in the early days, like you said, there's only a handful of people that sat down and actually wrote, this is what I've done, this is why, and this is how you do that. I mean,
And
just-
why are they writing? We don't know that.
Exactly. Who are they writing it for? I mean, today, we have a world where, everybody can do a how-to book, or you can do a desktop publishing, or you make your own YouTube video and whatever. But certainly in these early, centuries ago, there wasn't a whole lot of that happening. But what we have is certainly a lot of evidence. There's a lot of material that you can see. And, as somebody who's looked at the evolution of these things, I can't help but think, I mentioned that, Iron Man, but you've got things here that just clearly are I don't know, they just represent, somebody thought about this a long time ago.
Right.
And so today, it's not like we're, maybe we're using new techniques. Maybe it's now, these 3D printers or whatever it might be. But there's a lot to be learned from just, studying this past.
Well, and within the technology framework, they were just as sophisticated as we are. So yeah, their engineering, material science and such had limits, but their understanding of the human body was not necessarily much less advanced than ours. Certainly, if you look at the final product and you put on a full harness that's been made for you, it's more mobile than the stuff the Army issued me to go sit in a vehicle in. Now, yeah, that's not made for me and so on, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, there's quite a lot of sophistication in the way these pieces are put together because soldiers are practical people. They don't want something that's not going to work.
Yeah.
And so the consumers of the armor would have been right there saying, I want it this way and that way.
yeah.
So you've got a fairly short feedback loop going through the system, whereas ours goes through, a bureaucracy that may or may not. So it's just a different way of thinking about the thing, trying to solve some of the same problems though. I think over time, we do get better at these things. Certainly things like the 3D printing are going to lend almost a replicator kind of
Sure.
option to build what you
Facilitating
want.
it. Now, in terms of the particular strategies and tactics that were used, you've looked carefully at these European martial arts and how they evolved. And yet we have other regions, I'm thinking particularly about Asia, where there's
Yeah.
a long history as well of warfare and different types of martial arts. So what are some either parallels or very real differences that you can describe between the two?
Right. Well, at the base, of course, all the arts have to deal with the human body and the way that it moves. And that's a commonality between whether you're talking ancient Egypt or Greece or medieval Europe or modern day or Asia, the body still moves the same way. So if you look at Asian manuscripts, you look at the older arts like Akajitsu that we have preserved, they do a lot of joint locks, they do a lot of throws. Not coincidentally, the European arts do exactly the same thing because they're trying for the same purpose. Now, there are some different assumptions about the equipment you're wearing, and that drives differences in the weapons that you use against it. For example, a samurai sword is long and curved. Excellent for cutting through unarmored things especially. The steppe people used curved swords as well because they're striking again unarmored people, so it makes a lot of sense, on horseback especially. European swords, though, were straight because when you're going against a solid armored bit, not only do you want that thrust, although you could do that with a curved weapon, but you want that percussive power at a narrow point of impact because you've got to cause damage through the stuff. In the head, you're not going to cut through it, but you cause a couple seconds or a second of reset,
kind of stun
and then
them.
you can do the grapple or whatever you need to do, get the point, bring the point to bear. So at root, the arts are very similar, but they diverge, of course, according to both cultural norms and technological bases. So there are different assumptions about what's appropriate for a samurai to do and not do, and what weapons are appropriate. That's culturally defined. It's not necessarily tactically defined. Now, that's not to say it's irrational, because within their schema, of course, they account for that. So the trick, again, goes back to our original topic of understanding, trying to understand the context, why these things were done the way they were done, when they were done, at the time when they were produced. We look at this and say, this is heavy, you couldn't possibly move. Well, they fought this way for almost 400 years. So probably it worked within that sphere. So the trick is to understand how it worked. If something doesn't make sense, then we're probably not understanding it.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair. And then again, the technology would change so that over time, you mentioned gunpowder, gradually this became less practical. It was hard to move massive numbers of people, and so suddenly you needed more mobility and new technologies, right? And just in terms of the training, I mean, I'm reminded, of course, that the movie that on samurai of looking at the impact of the West arriving into Japan, and European powers had long done this, but I guess I'm trying to get at the idea, where do we see any evidence of technologies or ideas or strategies that suddenly came from other places?
Well, gunpowder, of course, comes from China originally, and it's a curious thing as to why, and they had rockets, but it's a curious thing as to why it didn't grow up, an enduring historical question as to why it didn't show up to be dominant for the Chinese. There are probably all sorts of social cultural reasons as to why they didn't equip people with firearms, and perhaps some technological limitations as well. And I think it goes down to cultural differences. You see, as you say in the cruise movie that you were citing, that you have, European and Dutch weapons coming in earlier. The Japanese at first adopt them, but then they reject them. And they were making very, very fine muskets and on a par or better than the stuff that was being made in Europe, but they decided culturally they didn't want it. And that's a thing that technology always has to wrestle with, because it's not a steady march necessarily. It's always tempered by, we're seeing, backlash now against technology, the Occupy movement and so on. It's like, and yet they're, texting on their phones that are made by this technology. So there's always a tension between what drives, or what is driven by technological change, and what the sort of cultural inertia that wants to both accept or reject that. And so
Tell me a little bit about, again, the academic connection, because you've got on one hand a personal fascination, and you wrote this book as you were preparing to embark on an academic career, but there's a whole world out there, just like you have Trekkie fans that have conferences, people who look at these issues and try to both deepen our knowledge, write more about it, critique it. I mean, what is that world like of these sort of this early warfare?
Yeah, you get a couple groups. You get the very few academics who meet at one or two conferences, one in Europe, one in the U.S. And it fills a small room. and those are the people who write academically about this stuff on a regular basis. They look at essentially warfare in a broader context, of which one subfield are the weapons and armor and how it's used. They look more at the impact of war on the societies of the time and how that drives social change and is driven by social change. But then, in addition to the academic groups, you have a group of historical European martial arts groups that have basically enthusiasts that have started schools around the world that work from the manuscripts. They typically know a great deal about the techniques that are used and not so much about the context. So they get in and they practice 1 or 2 or 3 times or more times a week. Some of them do a lot of conditioning, CrossFit-y sort of stuff to be able to haul the gear around. And then they do tournaments and things of that sort. Then you get more reenactor kind who want to reenact a battle. So you have the group that does the Battle of Hastings, for example, and you get out there with a bunch of people who are armed approximately like it was in 1066. Horses come thundering across. By the way, the ground actually does shake when they come. It's kind of amazing. And then you get groups that are more of a social society that also has fighting and tournaments and so on, more of an Arthurian kind of presentation on it. So you get this whole spectrum of people sort of that have crossover and form sort of a loose-knit network, a social network, if you will, of people who are interested in this kind of topic.
Now, let me ask you, as a historian and someone who teaches about both early history, but even more contemporary issues, and we'll kind of turn to that for the last segment, but when we study early history, clearly wars were just part of what was going on. I mean, there was movement of people in armies, there was a lot of expanding borders and empires. How would you describe to somebody, I mean, what do we gain from having that understanding? Why should we worry, or not worry, why should we learn and study the past, and especially these issues of warfare? What does it do for our own, human understanding?
Well, arguably, warfare is one of the main drivers of political change on a macro scale. I mean, you can think of Napoleon at Waterloo, for example, losing Waterloo, and his entire regime falls apart as a result of that. And of course, he remade the borders of Europe. You can think of the 30 Years' War that gave us the shape of modern Europe, for example. You can think of the Korean War that froze an artificially divided Korea north and south.
And these things, many that you described, they're still alive with us today, and you can't make sense of that. And I myself, I focus more on contemporary years. I teach a course on European Union. You cannot understand that without knowing the world wars, without knowing the previous centuries of lots of warfare, so that the idea of Europe as the European Union that we know today, the last 50, 60 years, comes out of that context.
Absolutely it does.
You can't, and so you need to know some of that, and certainly history is critical. And as a historian, again, history is something that it's not fixed. It's constantly revisited and with new information and new people that are looking at, asking different questions that allows you to kind of revisit a lot of those same.
Well, in a lot of ways, the history that's written now tells us more about our time than it does about the past. It's really how we think about what happened in the past. So historiography, of course, is the study of that over time as to how we look at the Cold War now differently than when things were written in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, because they were in the midst of the thing. So our understanding of events changes, our judgments about what's important and what's not important, which variables are more important, that shifts over time. And so I think the challenge is to understand as much as we can about how people thought about it then, but then to bring that information forward so that we make better decisions today.
Excellent. Well, on that, we're going to take a final break here, and we're going to come back after the short break. We're going to speak with a final segment that kind of turns us more to some contemporary issues. And Brian Price, a military historian who teaches both about early warfare and some of these, interesting puzzles that we've seen here, but as well, more recent work that he's been looking at, the development of the U.S. Air Force. The Air Force itself is a relatively new part of our military in the grand scheme of things, coming 1950s, 47 in the late, essentially after World War II, and yet it itself went through an important change after the Vietnam period. And so one of the recent projects he's looked at is the Air Force post-Vietnam, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we come back for the final segment. Join us again here for more on this story.
Here's the deal. I'm Jay Fidel. I'm the host of Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy, which is the Energy Policy Forum's program on Wednesday. That's how we call Wednesday Energy Wednesday. We call it Energy Wednesday every Wednesday. Are you surprised? Okay, and we try to get guys like Jim Alberts here from Hawaiian Electric who can tell us what's really going on in energy. We want to be informed. It's so important. It's the most important initiative in our state. Clean energy is major, okay? And that's why we cover it on this show. That's the deal. What do you think, Sharon?
I think that's great. That's why we're here every Wednesday from 4 to 5, and we hope you all join us so we can hear people like Jim coming on our show and co-host Ray Starley from Hawaii Energy.
Okay, Jim, you've been here today. You've seen this. You heard what she said. What do you think?
I think it's a tremendous opportunity for people to come together and talk about the issues. Oftentimes, there isn't a good forum to bring these key issues out into the public, and this is a tremendous way to go about it. And the activity of this show is essential to keep talking about energy because, as you said, it's such an essential part of our lives that we need to pay attention to it and we need to think about the future.
Okay, Ray, your turn.
Well, this is a special time in the history of Hawaii where we're making some pretty radical changes in the way we use energy and generate energy. And this show is the one place you can count on coming to every Wednesday and hearing something about the latest issues that are on the table, being discussed, that will affect us all going forward. So come join us, and if you have some ideas you want to share with us about energy, give us a call and let us know. We'll put you up here and let you talk for an hour. So come see us.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, Jim. It's great to be, from ThinkTech's point of view, it's great to have this show. We love the show. It's our most important show. So come around and listen to us 4 to 5 on Wednesday. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Aloha and welcome back. Carlos Juarez here, your host on Global Connections. And today we've been speaking with Brian Price, a military historian who has given us a little bit of background on some of these early, I guess, armor and medieval armor, and speaking of European martial arts. And actually, we're going to take a quick snapshot of a YouTube clip that shows how some of these equipment and things have been used here in some, how would you describe and set this
In
up for
Oahu,
us?
these are students who are learning the historical European martial arts based on the treatises. So.
Excellent. So let's take a quick look at the initial video clip. And maybe if you want to describe what you're seeing
Yeah,
here.
we've got me in the black and white, and we've got one of my students, Scott, in the yellow and
Everybody wants to
silver.
do this. I mean, we do this as little kids. Here you're doing it with some real armor.
I never grew up, so it's clearly, we're using rebated steel swords here, and we're fighting full. We're not pulling the blows back. Obviously, we're not. If the thrust goes in, we pull it back a bit so you don't actually run them through. But you're trying for the solid contact. It's not a tappy thing. And it would be possible to wrestle here, although I don't believe we do it in this fight.
Okay.
So you're just seeing sort of the fast
Yeah,
exchange.
the
It's much quicker than you
swords.
might expect.
Yeah,
And he stuck me in
fascinating.
the chest really well there. So.
Yeah, and looking at this, this headband, I mean, it doesn't give you a lot of vision. You've got to know where
but
you are.
But there's enough.
There's enough to see, and you want that protection more than
That's
anything.
right.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And today you still have essentially clubs that help to practice and maintain some of these martial arts as you've described. And maybe one more. We'll see the second clip
Sure.
if you want to tell us a little bit about this second one.
We have a club here on Oahu that does this, and
Mm-hmm.
we practice Sundays. We've got a little place down in Kalihi, so
Nice.
look for it on Meetup, and you'll find it there.
Okay, Let's see if we might pull up, here's another one, and just tell us what we've got here, a
This
different
is
weapon.
a poleaxe fight
Oh,
between my
boy.
2 senior students.
Oh, my God.
So yeah, the poleaxe was a very serious weapon for defeating armor.
Yeah.
These are rubber poleaxe heads, but they hit like a tank. So
Hard
you
rubber.
know when you've been hit.
Yes.
And it encourages people to actually use it like a poleaxe instead of like a toy. You'll notice he sticks them with the butt end as well as the whole axe is a weapon.
Yeah,
And this is what one commentator historically called ponderous, cruel, and mortal,
Oh,
because
boy.
it's very difficult to control your opponent's axe without actually disarming him, which you'd like to do.
Oh, boy.
And he just did it.
Boom, boom, that's it. Wow, fascinating. And again, this is a way of sort of keeping history alive, those who are interested in both the use of these different weapons and technologies. Fascinating stuff. Now, as we turn now in the last part of our show, I wanted to, bring us and have you share a little bit of some of your recent work. This past summer, you had opportunities to basically participate in some activities. Tell us a little bit about what you were doing and then what project it speaks to, looking at the U.S. Air Force now in the post-Vietnam era.
I'm continuing research I started some years ago because, of course, the Air Force during Vietnam, like all the services, had all kinds of trouble with personnel, with aircraft that couldn't fly, with the wrong aircraft in the wrong place, with the SAMs over North Vietnam. And there were dramatic changes, not only in the technology following the Vietnam War, but also in the culture of the Air Force and in all the services. But I'm just using the Air Force as an example. Where you went away from a conscripted force to a professional force, very small, but very highly trained, very technical. And so the weapons that we see today, the F-22s that we see flying out of Honolulu, grew out of this period. So I was at Maxwell Air Force Base with the Air Force Historical Research Association.
Alabama?
Alabama,
Yeah,
Montgomery, Alabama, yeah. Not far from where Selma was and all those civil rights things occurred. And Maxwell is sort of the home of the Air War College and also where their archive is. So I spent some time there looking through the papers of generals and people involved with the development of these new weapon systems post-Vietnam to try and understand how these things came to be. It turns out that there was a movement called the Defense Reform Movement that some of our audience will no doubt remember, that was arguing that we shouldn't have $700 hammers and toilet seats and things like that, which is justified. They were arguing that weapons were too expensive. And this Defense Reform Movement put a lot of pressure through Congress on the technical services in particular. The Navy and the Air Force came under fire for the sophistication of their weapons that apparently were not working in Vietnam. So the Air Force had the challenge of creating these new weapons under fire of a movement that wanted to cut the budgets dramatically and such. So they, some generals inside, General Jones, who ran the Air Force at the time, Secretary of the Air Force, and his chosen protege, General Wilbur Creech, took those ideas, the Defense Reform Movement, wove them together with ideas that the Air Force Command had, and out of that came the Air Force, the weapons we know of as the F-16, which is still flying today, the F-15 and the F-14, which just recently retired from the U.S. arsenal, but the F-15 still flying in Saudi Arabia's arsenal will be there for another 20 years. So these things resonate. We're looking at the post-Vietnam era when they were created, and when they were put into the inventory, but it wasn't a done thing that they were necessarily going to get into the inventory. And our guys who go overseas today probably very happy that the F-16, for example, is equipped with all the electronic things that we have to protect against surface-to-air missiles. But that wasn't the original conception of the aircraft. The original conception was no electronics, no missiles, just a gunfighting, dogfighting aircraft. The blend of the reform movement and the establishment created the Air Force that we went into the Gulf War with. And demonstrated its prowess against Iraq in '93.
And how might you describe, maybe especially for people not as ensconced in sort of military jargon, but that more modern current Air Force that probably, how would you describe it from maybe what it had been leading up to Vietnam?
Well, of course, the Air Force and Navy are both very technical services, very imbued with leveraging the latest technological advantages that they can get through advanced technology, through DARPA and through their own research, the Defense Arms, I don't remember, Production Agency. But the Army that we had going in through the 60s, everything was flying higher and faster. It was all missiles. We thought that the missile would make the aircraft obsolete, and the missile would make dogfighting obsolete. We went into Vietnam, and it turns out that these old MiG-17s were shooting down our cutting-edge aircraft, the F-105 and birds like that, the F-4 Phantom, which is designed as a fighter to keep airplanes away from the Navy, not designed to go dogfighting or Vietnam.
That's right.
So because of those mistakes that were made for a variety of budget reasons during the 60s, the Air Force came out of it and said, we want to have aircraft that are multi-role so they can do a variety of things. They can do air-to-air combat, they can deliver nuclear weapons if they have to, but they can also do air-to-ground materials. And so there's a lot of interest in post-Vietnam working more closely with the Army in particular. And one of the subjects I'm looking at is how the very early joint activity occurred between really independent generals who were saying, look, we know our services aren't going to go along with this, but you and I will develop an understanding, we'll create this thing. And out of that came something we know as air-land battle, which was the first of the joint doctrine. So Air Force fighting with the Army, fighting with the Marines, all these groups cooperating, that started sort of in this era.
Yeah, and again, we know, especially after the 9/11 attacks, there was a lot of attention to both the large intelligence community that doesn't seem to talk to each other, but in a similar vein, the Defense Department, these large separate branches, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, have kind of created their own cultures, and they often aren't talking to each other, and their weapons may not always have been in sync. The hope, and I think maybe the goal of trying to revise that is to work more closely together. And while we associate Air Force understandably with the air, the reality is that the Navy has its own air power, the Army has its own, air power, and how do they reconcile all that? Who gets to do what? And what is the role of the Air Force? Interestingly, both of you and I grew up as Air Force brats, our fathers having long careers in that branch. But maybe a few things, because since you yourself teach a lot of different military folks here, I mean, what are some of the either images or stereotypes we often have about the Air Force, or maybe another way is what is it they actually do relative to the Army, which is the big sort of main one, the Navy, which clearly has a role in maritime. Where does the Air Force fit into that, given the reality that these other branches also have their own air power?
They do, and of course, it's been a debate since air power first came in during World War I and after in the interwar period as to whether an Air Force would be independent, as Hugh Trenchard and the British RAF said, and Billy Mitchell on the US side would argue that way, or whether it was supposed to be more tied to what the ground operations were. And the argument was at the time that, and it still has some currency today, it is still a debate, but to what extent is tactical air power, the air power supporting ground operations, that is not the only mission they have, that is a mission that they have. The Army, of course, wants to own that mission because they want to be able to coordinate that for the best use of the ground command, which makes perfect sense. The Air Force's argument to that is usually something along the lines of, yes, that's one of our missions. Our other missions, though, are to maintain nuclear deterrence, to conduct strategic actions that can cause an opponent to change their actions without necessarily having to go into the ground. And so the debate as to how effective that can be, and I think really it sets up, do you set objectives that make the use of air power perhaps appropriate in this context? The Navy, also being a highly technical force, has interest in this as well, because they power projection through the fleets, and the fleets extended with air power, fleet-based air power. So they sort of share and compete with the Air Force on this. Mostly people who come at it from the ground perspective believe the Air Force guys to be kind of, I call them zoomies sometimes, and that they're really not aware of what's going on the ground, they're not involved in the battle. But that's not the culture that I grew up with, or that you probably grew up with. I grew up on strategic air command bases, so if there was going to be a nuclear exchange, we were ground zero, not the guys in the Army base. Right. So it's just a different kind of risk, I think, and a different sort of way of serving.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. Again, someone like yourself, you provide both in your research and expertise an understanding of warfare from early times, but that helps inform and educate those who might be learning contemporary issues. You can't understand the world today without knowing where it came from, even in issues like warfare. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, Brian, as always, joining us here, sharing some of these props and an understanding of how we both teach about and keep alive the study of warfare. And it's not because we want to promote war, but it is certainly part of who we are as humans. We hope we're at a better position now where we're trying to resolve issues, without use of force. But, the world is a place where we will always have to be vigilant. There are some certainly dangers out there, but we continue to debate, what is the proper use of force and things like that. I know we'll bring you back for some more conversations about these issues. Delighted to welcome him today and to join us here on Global Connections as always. And to our listeners, having you join us here to understand a little bit more about some of these exciting things. Please join us again, as we'll be back next week with another show here on Global Connections. I'm your host, Carlos Juarez, and delighted to welcome Brian Price again, and look forward to a next chance to see you here once again.
Great pleasure.
Thank you again. Aloha.